The sound of oak striking oak echoed through the cabin like a rifle shot. It rolled across the great room with its 20-foot ceiling and its hand-hewn beams past the stone fireplace wide enough to roast a whole elk, past the gun rack holding 3 Winchester rifles and a Sharps buffalo gun that had not been fired in 6 years, past the mounted head of a grizzly bear that Thomas Callahan had killed with a single shot in the spring of 1861, and out through the gaps in the window frames where the November wind was already pushing fingers of cold into every corner of the house. Nathaniel Callahan had just slammed his fist on the desk. Across from him stood a woman in a dark blue traveling dress, her face the color of fresh snow, her gloved hands clutching a carpet bag as though it were the last solid thing in a world that had suddenly gone liquid. Her name was Gertrude. She was 41 years old, a widow from Ohio, and she had arrived at Wolf Ridge 3 hours and 47 minutes ago on a hired wagon that had taken 4 hours to climb the 12 miles of switchback mountain road from Moss Creek. She had come with 2 suitcases, a letter of introduction from Mrs. Adelaide Pruitt, and a smile full of hope. The suitcases were still by the door. The letter lay unread on the desk, and the smile was dead. I do not need a wife. Nate's voice was low and flat, the way a frozen lake is flat, the way the sky before a blizzard is flat. It was the voice of a man who had learned to strip emotion from language, the way a trapper strips hide from bone. Clean, efficient, final. I did not place that advertisement. I did not ask anyone to send you here. The next wagon down to Moss Creek leaves at 4 o'clock. I will pay your fare back to Cheyenne. Gertrude did not need to hear it twice. She turned, collected her suitcases with the mechanical precision of a woman who had rehearsed this possibility on the month-long ride up the mountain, and walked out the front door into the November cold. 10 minutes later, the sound of the wagon wheels grinding against frozen dirt faded down the switchback road, swallowed by the vastness of the Bighorn Mountains, and Wolf Ridge was silent again. Nate stood at the window and watched her go. He always stood at the window. 23 times now he had watched a woman leave Wolf Ridge through this same glass, down this same road, disappearing around the same bend, where the ponderosa pines grew so thick that the trail seemed to close behind whoever passed through, as though the mountain itself were sealing the exit. Each time he felt the same thing. Relief that came first sharp and immediate, like the gasp of air after being held underwater. And then underneath, spreading slow like blood through snow, the emptiness that he would never admit to any living soul, but that Martha Briggs could read on his face the way Colt Graves read tracks in fresh mud. Martha was standing in the kitchen doorway. She was 58 years old, silver-haired, built like a fence post, and she had been the housekeeper of Wolf Ridge since before Nate could walk. She had cooked 10,000 meals in that kitchen. She had birthed calves, set broken fingers, stitched wounds that would have made a field surgeon wince, and buried both of Nate's parents with her own hands. She feared God, respected weather, and tolerated nonsense from no man alive, including the one who paid her wages. 23, Martha said. It was not a question. I can count Martha. Your mother would have something to say about this. Nate did not answer. He did not turn around. Because if he looked into Martha's eyes, he would see what he was trying not to see in his own reflection. Not loneliness. He had tamed that years ago the way you tame a horse that bites, not by breaking it, but by learning to live with the teeth. What he would see was waste. He was 32 years old. He owned a mountain stronghold that his father had built from nothing over 30 years. 3 cabins, a 2-story main house, a stable, a tannery, a storehouse packed with furs worth thousands of dollars. Trap lines running 300 square miles through some of the richest hunting ground left in the American West. A spring-fed creek that provided water to 20 ranches and the entire town of Moss Creek in the valley below. And at night, one man sitting alone by a fire big enough for 10, listening to the wind, talk to the mountain in a language he understood better than any human tongue. Wolf Ridge was not a ranch. It was a fortress. Thomas Callahan had built it that way on purpose. He had come to Wyoming in 1850, a Scottish immigrant with a compass, a rifle, and a stubbornness that the mountain itself seemed to recognize as kindred. He chose this spot 7,500 feet up the western slope of the Bighorn Range for 3 reasons. First, the water. Callahan Creek began as snowmelt on the peaks above and ran straight through the property before cascading down to the valley, which meant that whoever held Wolf Ridge held the water supply for the entire region. Second, the fur trade route. The only trail connecting the rich northern hunting grounds to the Moss Creek trading post ran directly through Wolf Ridge land, which made Thomas not just a trapper, but a gatekeeper. Third defense. The cabin sat with its back against a granite cliff, face its front overlooking the valley, and its flanks protected by dense stands of ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. In 1850, there was no law in Wyoming except the law of survival, and Thomas Callahan had survived. Now in November 1884, Wyoming had sheriffs and courts and senators and the distant promise of statehood. But Wolf Ridge still felt like what it was, a fortress built by a man who trusted mountains more than people. And his son lived inside it the way a wounded animal lives inside its den, venturing out for necessity, but always returning to the dark. To understand why you had to go back 4 years. Catherine Prescott was the daughter of Ezekiel Prescott, who owned a cattle ranch in the valley below Wolf Ridge. She had golden hair that caught the light like aspen leaves in October, and a laugh that Nate swore he could hear through 3 ridges of timber. He had courted her for 2 years with the earnest clumsiness of a man who understood elk migration patterns better than he understood women. He gave her a young mare that he had gentled himself over 6 months, whispering to it every evening until it would eat from his palm. He read her Tennyson by the creek, though his poetry voice, according to Jesse McAllister, sounded less like a romantic and more like a bull elk with digestive troubles. And one night in March, under a sky so dense with stars that the Milky Way looked like a trail of spilled flour across God's kitchen floor, he knelt on the opposing ground and asked her to marry him, with the ring his mother had worn for 30 years. Catherine said yes. 3 weeks before the wedding, she vanished. The truth arrived the way truth always arrives in small towns, not announced, but whispered. At the Moss Creek General Store, at the barber shop, at the post office where letters were everyone's business because everyone knew everyone's handwriting. Catherine had been writing in secret to a man named Douglas Harrington, a railroad investor from Chicago. A man who owned more money in his bank account than Wolf Ridge was worth in land and furs combined. Harrington lived in a city with theaters, dress shops, cobblestone streets, and gas lamps that burned all night. He offered Catherine everything that Wolf Ridge could not. She married him within the month. Nate did not chase her. He did not write. He did not drink himself into oblivion, though he wanted to because his father had warned him once, sitting in this very room, whiskey in hand, that Callahan men feel too much and must never give their feelings liquid fuel. 1 glass a night, Thomas had said. Never more, because a Callahan drunk is a Callahan destroyed. What Catherine's departure taught Nate was worse than betrayal. Betrayal he could have fought. What she taught him was that the thing he loved most in the world, this mountain, this silence, this vast and ancient emptiness, where the wind spoke and the elk moved and the seasons turned with the mechanical precision of a clock made by God, this was the thing that drove people away. The isolation he found beautiful, she found unbearable. The silence he heard as music, she heard as suffocation. She did not leave because Nate was cruel. She left because Wyoming was wild, and Wolf Ridge was the wildest place in Wyoming, and Catherine Prescott wanted tame. That understanding broke something in Nate that he never repaired. Because if the thing you love is the reason you cannot be loved, then there is no solution. You cannot stop loving the mountain, and you cannot make the mountain into a city, so you build walls. You stop letting people in, and every woman who arrives at your door carrying hope and a smile becomes a threat because she carries the implicit promise that she will stay, and you know in your blood and your bones that she will not. 23 times Nate Callahan rejected before he could be rejected. Downstairs in the kitchen, warmed by a cast iron stove that Thomas Callahan had hauled up the mountain by mule, in 1856 2 men were eating supper. Colton Graves sat at the far end of the table. He was 28 years old, lean as a rawhide whip with wheat-colored hair, eyes the color of a January creek, and a scar that ran from his left ear to his jawline in a clean diagonal that suggested a knife wielded with either great skill or great luck. When asked about the scar, Colt said 3 words, "Trouble in Abilene." He never elaborated. Colt had arrived at Wolf Ridge 7 years ago as a drifter. Before that, Missouri, Kansas, Texas, and 1 dark year in New Mexico that he did not discuss, a year that left him with the scar, a bone-deep self-loathing, and a determination to become something other than what he had been. What he had been in that year was a hired gun in a range war that killed 11 men, 3 of whom died looking at Colt's face as the last thing they would ever see. He carried that knowledge the way some men carry war wounds, invisibly, permanently, with a quiet pain that surfaced only in the small hours when sleep would not come. He found Nate Callahan in Wolf Ridge, and in Nate's quiet, principled stubbornness, Colt found a man worth following. They built a partnership without ever naming it, a trust forged not in conversation, but in shared labor in the 600 small acts of survival that mountain life demanded every day. Checking trap lines in waist-deep snow, breaking ice on the creek at dawn so the horses could drink, sitting up all night with a rifle across the knees when wolves circled the stock. Colt did not speak much. He did not need to. Nate understood silence and Colt understood loyalty, and between those two fluencies, they built something as solid as the granite cliff behind the cabin. At the other end of the table, Jesse McAllister was talking. Jesse was always talking. He was 25 years old, the youngest of the senior men at Wolf Ridge, and he was built the way a barrel is built, compact, solid, and impossible to tip over. He had curly red-brown hair, a gap-toothed grin that could light a room faster than a kerosene lamp, a permanently sunburned face regardless of season, and a habit of pushing his hat back on his head at an angle that Mrs. Adelaide Pruitt down in Moss Creek described as entirely too jaunty for a man of his station. Jesse came from a large Irish-American family in Montana, fifth of 8 children. His upbringing was loud, loving, and poor. He came to Wyoming at 21 chasing wages to send home to his mother, and he stayed because Wolf Ridge felt like family, a quieter, stranger family than the McAllisters, but family all the same. He worshipped Nate with the uncritical devotion of a younger brother and regarded Colt with a mixture of respect and affectionate exasperation, Colt's silence being a personal challenge that Jesse had been trying and failing to crack for 4 years. At this moment, Jesse was describing with elaborate hand gestures his third encounter with a bull elk that he was convinced harbored a personal grudge against him. "I am telling you, Colt, that elk looked at me, not past me, not through me, at me with contempt, personal contempt, like I owed him money." Colt cut his venison stew into smaller pieces. No response. "Are you hearing me?" "Hearing you. That is it. I just delivered a gripping tale of interspecies conflict, and you give me 2 words." Colt looked up. One corner of his mouth moved approximately 1/8 of an inch upward. This was the Colt Graves equivalent of a standing ovation. Jesse considered it a major victory. Martha placed a fresh pan of cornbread on the table. Number 23 just left. The Ohio Widow lasted 3 hours and 47 minutes. Jesse whistled. New record. No, the Kansas Girl number 17 lasted 2 hours and 31 minutes. But in fairness, Nate was in a particularly foul mood that day because the bay mare had kicked through the east fence. "He needs a woman," Jesse said, and his voice shifted, the laughter draining out of it the way water drains from a cracked bucket, leaving something heavier underneath. "Not because of the stronghold, because of him. I see how he sits by that fire every night, Colt. Nobody should stare into fire that long. You start seeing things that are not there. Or worse, you start seeing things that are." Colt stopped cutting his venison. A silence passed between them that carried the weight of years shared on a mountain. Then Colt nodded, a small nod, but Jesse understood. Agreement. That night, while the first blizzard of winter gathered its strength over the Bighorn Peaks, Wolf Ridge settled into darkness. 15 seasonal trappers slept in the 3 bunkhouse cabins. Martha banked the kitchen fire. Jesse cleaned his rifle by lamplight, humming an Irish song his mother had taught him badly. Colt patrolled the horse stable, checking each animal, each lock, each shadow, the way he did every night, because Colt had learned long ago that the things that kill you come in the dark and they do not knock first. In the study that had been his father's, Nate sat alone before a dead fireplace with a glass of whiskey, the one glass, and stared at the cedar chest on the desk, his mother's chest. It contained Margaret Callahan's collection of frontier sketches, ink and charcoal drawings she had made over 30 years of life on this mountain, and Nate had not opened it since the day Catherine left. But he had not moved it from the desk either. It sat there like a question he could not answer and could not stop asking. Outside, the temperature dropped. The pines groaned under wind. Snow began to fall, thickening as the storm found its rhythm. By midnight, visibility on the mountain road was less than 10 feet, and any sane person would be indoors behind walls with fire and blankets, in the good sense God gave a house cat. Colt was in the south stable when he saw it, a shape on the road, moving uphill, on foot, not on horseback, Not in a wagon, on foot, alone, in the dark, in a blizzard, climbing a mountain. Colt stood still for one full second before his body caught up with his brain, and he moved toward the figure with the long, silent stride of a man who had spent a lifetime learning to walk without being heard. He whistled for Jesse, the sharp two-note whistle that meant come now. When Colt got close enough to see clearly through the driving snow, he realized the shape was a young woman. She wore a gray wool coat that was at least 2 grades too thin for Wyoming mountain weather, a bonnet that the wind had shoved sideways, and she was dragging a small leather suitcase, the cheap kind, worn at the corners, the kind owned by people who did not have enough possessions to justify a better one. She was shaking. Her entire body trembled with a violence that seemed almost mechanical. Her lips were the color of a bruise, but she was still walking. Step after step, uphill into the wind, with the relentless forward momentum of someone who had decided that stopping was not an option and had burned that bridge so thoroughly that even the ashes were gone. Colt stepped into her path. "Ma'am, storm is coming hard. You should not be out here." She looked up at him. Her eyes were hazel large, and they held something that Colt recognized instantly because he had carried it himself for half his life. The look of someone who had nothing left to lose, and instead of making them weak, that knowledge had burned away everything that was not essential and left behind a core of pure concentrated determination. "I am looking for the Callahan place, Wolf Ridge. You are standing on it." "Good." She tightened her grip on the suitcase. "My name is Eliza Thornton. I came from Nebraska. I answered the advertisement in the newspaper." Colt understood immediately. Bride number 24. Jesse arrived eyes wide. "Colt, I got Nate. He is coming." He saw Eliza. "Oh, hello, ma'am. You walked up here, up the mountain in a blizzard." "My hired wagon broke an axle 9 miles down. The driver turned back for repairs. I did not want to wait." "You walked 9 miles up a mountain in the snow with a suitcase. Ma'am, and I mean this with the greatest respect. Are you out of your mind?" The corner of Eliza's mouth moved upward by a fraction. Not a smile, the ghost of one. "Possibly, but I have come too far to turn back." Nate appeared at the cabin door, leather coat thrown on unbuttoned dark hair wild in the wind. He saw Colt. He saw Jesse. He saw Eliza. And his jaw locked into the position that had become as instinctive as breathing. "No." One word, voice flat, gray eyes cold. "Mr. Callahan." Eliza's voice cut through his like a scalpel through gauze. Small but precise. She did not shout. She did not plead. "I walked 9 miles up a mountain in a blizzard. I cannot feel my toes. This suitcase contains everything I own in this world. You can send me away in the morning. But if you send me out tonight on this mountain road in this darkness, then you are not the man that advertisement described. You are just a killer." The word killer landed differently at 7,500 feet because the mountain road at night in a blizzard genuinely killed people. 3 men had died on that road in the last 10 years. Nate knew their names. Silence. Wind screamed around the eaves. Nate looked at her. Truly looked the way a man looks at something when he stops defending and starts seeing. She was small. The coat was too thin. The suitcase was cheap. No wedding ring. No jewelry. Shoes worn through at the soles. And her eyes did not contain the thing he had seen in the eyes of 23 women before her, that mixture of hope and calculation and romantic expectation that triggered every alarm in his fortress heart. Her eyes contained something else. The exhaustion of a person who had fought alone for too long and had finally reached a place that she prayed would be safe. Martha appeared behind Nate, looked over his shoulder, and spoke in a voice that permitted no discussion. "Bring the girl inside. Now, I will heat water." Nate stepped aside. He did not speak. He simply moved his body out of the doorway, and Eliza Thornton, 22 years old, never married, never kissed, carrying everything she owned in a battered suitcase, stepped across the threshold of the mountain fortress. Inside, Martha guided Eliza to the kitchen, wrapped a wool blanket around her shoulders, and placed before her a bowl of hot venison stew and a mug of tea. Eliza held the mug with both hands, and for the first time since entering the cabin, her shoulders dropped, an inch, maybe 2. But Martha noticed because Martha always noticed, and she understood that those shoulders had been carrying something heavier than a suitcase. Nate stood in the kitchen doorway, not entering, not leaving, watching. Where do you come from? Martha asked softly. Nebraska, outside Lincoln. Alone? Alone. Family. Eliza set down the mug. My father died when I was 17. Samuel Thornton. He was a wheat farmer. He taught me to read from the family Bible and to keep accounts in a ledger book. My brother William died of typhoid 2 years later. He left the farm to his wife Margaret, who remarried a man named Harold Fairchild. She said the name the way you say the name of a disease, factually, without emotion, but with the slight tightening of the jaw that tells you the speaker has practiced saying it without emotion many times. Mr. Fairchild is a grain merchant, 41 years old. He decided that I would marry his business partner, a man named Silas Pennington. Mr. Pennington is 53. I have never met him. When I refused Mr. Fairchild informed me that I would be removed from the farm, the house where I was born, with nothing. No money, no belongings, no letters of reference. She picked up the mug again, took a sip, and set it down with a precision that suggested she was controlling each movement. In 1884, Nebraska, an unmarried woman without family money or references has three choices: marriage to whoever will take her, domestic service if she can find it, or destitution. I chose a fourth option. I answered an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. You came here to marry Nate, Martha said, not unkindly. No. Eliza looked up, and for the first time her eyes met Nate's across the room. Just two human beings tired looking at each other. I did not come here to marry Mr. Callahan. I came because I needed a place that was safe, far from Nebraska, far from Harold Fairchild. I can cook clean, keep ledger books, grow herbs for medicine, and do every kind of work that a homestead requires. I do not need Mr. Callahan to love me. I do not need him to marry me. I only need a place where no one decides my life for me. The fire in the stove crackled. Outside, the wind howled. And in the kitchen of Wolf Ridge, something shifted with the quiet, tectonic certainty of a glacier changing course. Because in 23 previous arrivals, every woman had come wanting Nate, wanting his money, his land, his name, his heart. And every one of those wants had triggered the same response, the drawbridge going up, the walls going higher. But Eliza Thornton had not come wanting Nate. She had come wanting safety. And in the absence of romantic expectation, Nate's defenses found nothing to defend against. 1 week, Nate said. You can stay 1 week. We will see. Then he turned and climbed the stairs, and the sound of his boots on the oak treads was the only sound in the house. Colt was not looking at Jesse. He was looking at Eliza, specifically at her left wrist where the blanket had slipped, revealing a small scar. Old, healed white. Colt did not know the story behind it, but he recognized the type. He had spent enough years among damaged people to know the difference between a scar earned in accident and a scar earned in captivity. Something in his gaze shifted, not softened, focused, sharpened, like steel being honed. He would watch this one. The days that followed were not easy. Nate treated Eliza like an uninvited guest, polite but distant. He avoided being in the same room. He communicated through Martha. When forced to speak directly, he used the shortest possible sentences. His hands, massive, calloused, and scarred, always found work when Eliza was nearby. Splitting wood, mending traps, anything to avoid sitting still with her presence. But Eliza was not like the 23 before her. She did not try to breach his walls. She simply worked. The first morning she was up before dawn in the kitchen, asking Martha what needed doing. The second day she had mastered the kitchen schedule and taken over breakfast preparation for the entire stronghold. The third day she discovered that Wolf Ridge's accounting ledgers were, in her precise word, a disaster of the first order, and asked permission to reorganize them. Nate agreed because the ledgers genuinely were a disaster. But the thing that truly changed everything happened on the fourth night. Eliza could not sleep. The blizzard had passed, but the wind remained, and the cabin groaned like a ship on rough seas. She came down to the kitchen to make tea and found Nate sitting at the table in the dark. The cedar chest was open before him. He was holding a sketch and looking at it with an expression she had never seen on his face. The hardness was gone. What lay beneath was something infinitely more vulnerable: grief and love, and the ache of holding something precious that belonged to someone who was gone. He did not hear her enter. When he looked up, his first reaction was to close the chest, fast, almost panicked. I am sorry, Eliza said, stepping back. I only wanted tea. Wait, he said it before he could stop himself. They were both surprised. My mother's drawings. She drew everything, the meadows, the mountains, the creeks. She said it was how she talked to the land. Eliza did not speak. She did not ask questions. She simply stood, and in her silence, Nate found the thing he had not found in 23 encounters. Space, room to speak without being judged, without being consoled. I have not opened this chest in 4 years. Not since Catherine left. Eliza sat down across from him and waited. Nate talked, not about everything, but enough. About Catherine, about the promise, about the morning he woke up and she was gone, about 23 brides, about the reason he sent them away, not hatred but fear. Why are you telling me this? Eliza asked when he stopped. Nate looked at her. Because you did not ask. In that answer, both of them understood something already putting down roots. The thing that connected them was not attraction. It was recognition. Two people betrayed by the people who should have protected them and who had built walls to survive. Loneliness, Eliza said softly. One word. And Nate looked at her as though she had read a page from a journal he had never written. The next morning, something shifted in the rhythm of Wolf Ridge. Nate began to stay in the room when Eliza was there. He began to sit down when she spoke instead of standing. He began rarely and briefly to answer questions with more than one word. Jesse noticed first. Nate spoke 3 complete sentences at supper last night. He reported to Colt with the breathless wonder of a man witnessing a miracle. 3. With subjects and predicates and everything. Colt said nothing, but he stopped whittling, which was his equivalent of dropping his jaw. On the 6th day, Jesse rode down to Moss Creek for mail and returned with a letter from Lincoln, Nebraska, signed Aunt Harold Fairchild. Harold claimed Eliza owed the Fairchild family $1,200 in room, board, and maintenance cuts. He demanded she return to Nebraska or face legal action. The letter ended with a sentence Nate read 3 times. Miss Thornton is the property of the Fairchild family until such time as the debt is settled in full. Property. Nate folded the letter. His jaw was set, but not in defense. This was anger. Fake debt, Colt said. 2 words, but delivered with absolute certainty. Obviously fake, Martha said. That is how Harold controlled her. If she stays, she obeys. If she leaves, he claims she owes money. Jesse was not smiling. He is coming here, is he not? Martha looked at the postmark. Letter was sent from Omaha. He is already on his way. That night, Nate made his decision. Eliza would stay, not as a bride, as a bookkeeper and assistant to Martha. Fair wages, her own room, no one controls her, no one decides for her. He would tell her in the morning. But before morning came, the mountain sent its own test. It arrived at 2 in the morning, announced not by sound, but by silence. The horses went quiet first. 15 animals in the south stable, all of them breathing fast ears, flat eyes rolling, but not one making a sound. That silence woke Colt the way a gunshot would have woken anyone else. He was out of his bunk and moving before his conscious mind had caught up with his instincts, pulling on boots, grabbing his rifle, stepping into the frozen dark. He smelled it before he saw it. A thick, musky animal smell that cut through the clean cold of the mountain air like a blade through cloth. Bear. Not the distant, faded scent of a bear that had passed through hours ago. The immediate, overpowering smell of a large animal very close. And then he heard the growl. Low, deep. A vibration that came through the ground before it reached the air, the sound of a chest cavity, the size of a rain barrel pushing air through a throat thick with muscle and fury. Old Silver. Every trapper in the Bighorn Range knew the name. A grizzly bear 12 years old, 700 pounds with patches of silver fur scattered across a dark brown coat and a body covered in scars from 100 fights he had won. 3 men had died because of Old Silver in the last decade. The Shoshone called him the one who walks in shadow. Colt had seen him twice from a distance, and both times he had felt something he rarely felt. Respect braided together with fear. Old Silver had come to Wolf Ridge for the same reason any predator comes close to humans in winter. Hunger. The first storehouse, with its smell of tanned hides and animal fat, was a beacon. The horse stable full of warm, panicking animals was a feast. Colt fired his revolver once into the air. The sound cracked the silence like a whip. Inside the cabin, Jesse was out of bed and moving before the echo, dyed boots and coat and rifle, in a sequence so practiced it was almost mechanical. Nate was already at the door, Winchester in hand, scanning the tree line. Old Silver, Colt called from the stable. North tree line, moving toward the horses. Jesse, stay at the cabin, Nate ordered. Protect Eliza and Martha. Colt with me. Jesse started to protest. He always wanted to be where the danger was, but Nate's eyes stopped him. This was not a request. They should have been right. The bear should have circled the first storehouse, been driven off by gunfire, and vanished into the timber. That was what grizzlies did. They probed, they tested, they retreated when the cost outweighed the reward. But Old Silver did not circle the storehouse. The bear changed direction and came at the horse stable from the east side where the wall was weakest and where the panicked screaming of 15 horses created a sound that apparently overrode every calculation a 12-year-old grizzly had learned about avoiding men with guns. The east wall exploded inward with a crack of splintering timber, and 700 pounds of muscle and fury poured through the gap into a confined space full of rearing, kicking, hysterical animals. Jesse heard the wall break from inside the cabin. He did not think. He did not calculate. He simply moved because Jesse McAllister, underneath the jokes and the laughter and the stories about elk with personal grudges, was a man who could not bear the sound of animals in pain. He grabbed his rifle and ran toward the stable. He arrived at the same moment Old Silver finished tearing through the wall and turned in the enclosed space looking for the largest target. Jesse and the bear saw each other simultaneously. Jesse fired. The shot went wide because the stable was dark and full of dust and flying straw and horses screaming in every direction, and the bear was moving with a speed that nothing weighing 700 pounds should have been able to achieve. Old Silver swung one enormous forepaw, a casual, almost lazy motion, the way a man swats a fly, and the blow caught Jesse across the ribs and launched him backward into the stable wall. He hit the wood with a sound like a sack of grain dropped from a height and slid to the ground and did not move. Eliza heard everything from the cabin, the wall breaking, the horses screaming, the gunshot, the impact. She did not think either. She grabbed the kerosene lantern from the kitchen table, the one Martha kept burning all night because Martha believed that a house without light was a house without hope, and she ran. Martha shouted after her. Eliza did not stop. She reached the stable door and saw Jesse lying in the straw, blood on his forehead. Motionless and beyond him in the darkness, a pair of small eyes reflecting the lantern light with the dull, ancient intelligence of an animal that has learned to fear nothing. Old Silver was turning back toward Jesse. Eliza raised the lantern above her head. She filled her lungs, and she screamed, not a scream of fear, a scream of pure, concentrated, desperate fury, the scream of a woman who had walked 9 miles through a blizzard and survived Harold Fairchild and refused Silas Pennington and traveled 1,000 miles to find safety and would not watch someone die in front of her while she stood still. Then she threw the lantern. It arced through the dark stable, trailing a tail of kerosene like a comet, and shattered against the ground 3 feet from the bear's head. The kerosene ignited. A bloom of orange flame erupted across the damp straw, not enough to spread. The straw was too wet from snow, tracked in by boots, but enough to fill the enclosed space with sudden, blinding, unexpected light and heat. Old Silver stopped. Half a second, 1 full second, the tiny ancient brain behind those small eyes processing the new information. Fire noise, a creature standing upright and screaming and recalculating. That second was enough. 2 rifle shots cracked in rapid succession from the east. Nate and Colt arriving at a dead run, firing not to kill, but to drive, because killing a grizzly inside a stable full of panicking horses would create a catastrophe worse than the one they were trying to prevent. The bullets punched through the back wall behind the bear. Old Silver roared a sound that vibrated the walls and loosened dust from the rafters, and then turned and smashed through the broken east wall and vanished into the blizzard and the dark timber beyond. The bear was gone. Jesse was not. He was alive. Broken ribs, a deep gash across his left shoulder where the claws had caught him, and a concussion that left his eyes unfocused and his speech slurred. But alive, because Eliza Thornton, 22 years old from a wheat farm in Nebraska, had stood between him and 700 pounds of grizzly with nothing but a kerosene lantern and a refusal to be helpless. Eliza knelt beside him in the straw. Her hands were shaking. Her whole body was shaking. But her voice was steady as she examined the wound, probing the ribs with fingers that knew what they were feeling, because her father had taught her field medicine the same way he taught her everything else, practically thoroughly without sentiment. "2 ribs broken, maybe 3, she said to Martha, who had arrived with blankets and hot water. "The shoulder wound is deep but clean. No organs. He needs binding a poultice for the gash and whiskey for the pain." "We use whiskey for everything on this mountain," Martha said, already tearing cloth for bandages. Nate stood in the stable doorway, rifle still in hand, snow melting on his shoulders. He watched Eliza work, her hands moving with the quick, certain efficiency of someone who had done this before, not with bear wounds specifically, but with the general principle of broken bodies and the urgent need to make them less broken. She had not hesitated. She had not frozen. She had picked up a lantern and run toward a grizzly bear. Something shifted in Nate's expression. Not warmth, not yet, but the ground on which warmth might someday grow. A crack in the permafrost. When Jesse was stable, bandaged, dosed with whiskey, and installed in his bunk with strict orders from Martha not to move for 3 days, Nate found Eliza in the kitchen. She was washing Jesse's blood from her hands. Her fingers trembled under the water. "You saved him," Nate said. "I threw a lantern. You and Colt saved him. You gave us the second we needed. Without that—" He did not finish. He did not need to. "Are you going to send me away in the morning?" Eliza asked. And the question in this context, after what she had done, carried more weight than either of them expected. "No," Nate said. "Not in the morning, not ever." The word ever hung in the kitchen air between them, heavier than either of them intended, larger than the simple promise of employment it was meant to convey. Nate heard it. Eliza heard it. Neither mentioned it, but Martha, listening from the hallway, heard it too, and permitted herself a small, knowing smile. The morning of the 7th day, Eliza came down with her suitcase packed because she had lived long enough with rejection to always prepare for it. Nate stood at the kitchen table. Colt leaned against the back door. Jesse, against Martha's orders, had limped downstairs, one arm pressed against his bound ribs, because Jesse McAllister would rather be in pain among his people than comfortable alone. "Sit down, Miss Thornton," Nate said. Eliza sat, suitcase at her feet. "I have a proposal. You stay at Wolf Ridge, not as a bride, as a bookkeeper and assistant to Martha. Fair wages, your own room. No one controls you. No one decides for you." "Why?" "Because my ledgers are a disaster. And because—" He stopped, jaw tightened, then released. "And because no one should be called property." Eliza inhaled. She understood. Nate had read Harold's letter, and he had chosen a side. "Yes, I agree." Jesse, from his chair, managed a grin despite the pain. Colt nodded the nod of a gatekeeper admitting someone through the gate. Martha turned back to the stove, and if anyone had looked closely, they would have seen her wiping her eyes with the corner of her apron. And somewhere on the road from Cheyenne, getting closer with every mile, a man in an expensive wool coat sat in a hired coach with a leather briefcase full of documents and the smile of a person who believed that paper was stronger than stone. Harold Fairchild was coming, and he was not coming alone. 2 weeks after the night Eliza Thornton arrived at Wolf Ridge, the stronghold was a different place, not in its bones. The granite cliff still rose behind the cabin. The pines still creaked in the wind. The creek still ran its course down the slope. But something in the air had changed the way air changes when a window opens. Not warmer, not cooler, but moving, alive. Eliza had become part of the rhythm. Morning she rose before dawn, descending to the kitchen while the sky was still gunmetal, and took her place beside Martha at the stove. The two women developed a working synchronization that usually took months to build. Martha cooked. Eliza prepared. They moved around each other with wordless precision. Martha taught Eliza Wyoming venison stew, which used wild turnip instead of potato, and Eliza taught Martha her mother's cornbread recipe made with honey instead of sugar, which produced a result so extraordinary that Jesse, upon tasting it, closed his eyes and sat still for 4 seconds, the longest recorded silence of his conscious life. "Miss Thornton," Jesse declared, mouthful crumbs on his chin, "if Nate does not realize you are a miracle, I will propose to you myself." "You do not qualify," Martha said. "You do not even own a chicken." "I have personality." "Personality does not cook supper." Colt at the far end of the table said nothing. But he ate 2 full plates of cornbread. For Colt, that was a speech. Nate still kept his distance, but the distance was shrinking in ways everyone could see except him. He arrived at the kitchen earlier each evening because that was where Eliza sat reading after the day's work. He asked about the ledger's questions that started as business and became conversations. When Eliza discovered the Moss Creek trading post had been overcharging Wolfridge 15% on fur transport fees for 3 years and laid out the evidence in figures so precise they looked like bank audit work, Nate looked at her with an expression Jesse later described to Colton as approximately in the neighborhood of respect or at minimum astonishment. Colt's relationship with Eliza evolved differently. He did not chat, he observed. In the first days, he watched her with the wariness of instincts sharpened by violence, but he also protected her without instruction. When Eliza walked to the stable in the evening, Colt appeared nearby, never speaking, just present. When a trapper named Durkin looked at her too long over lunch, Colt simply stood up from the table. Just stood. Durkin looked elsewhere. One afternoon, Colt handed her a small wooden horse hand, carved detailed enough that the mane seemed to move. Eliza looked at it, then at him. "Thank you." Colt nodded, walked away. The entire conversation. But from that moment, Eliza understood. He was not protecting her because Nate told him to. He was protecting her because he saw in her the innocence he had failed to protect during his dark year in New Mexico. But beneath the surface calm, 3 threats were converging on Wolfridge. The first came from the mountain itself. In the second week of December, a cold snap descended that the oldest trappers said was the worst in 20 years. Temperatures plunged to 35 below zero. Callahan Creek froze solid in places it had never frozen before. The herd of horses and mules, 32 animals, that were the lifeblood of Wolfridge, were grazing in the high western meadow. If the ice sealed the grass before those animals were brought back, they would starve or freeze. Nate gathered his people. "We have to bring the horses down. The only route is through Devil's Funnel." Nobody spoke. They all knew Devil's Funnel, a narrow defile between 2 rock walls at 8,000 feet gravel floor that turned slick as glass under ice sheer drops on both sides 20 meters to a frozen creek bed. In good weather, it was hard. In ice, it killed. Colt would lead. Jesse Ribbs, still healing from the night old Silver visited, refused to stay behind. "I will hurt regardless of where I am. At least let me hurt somewhere useful." Eliza asked to go. Nate refused. Too dangerous. More dangerous than throwing a lantern at a grizzly bear. Silence. Jesse bit his cheek to keep from laughing. Colt looked at Nate and said, "She can ride. I checked." Nate looked at Colt with the mild expression of a man betrayed by his most trusted lieutenant. Then at the sky where clouds stacked over the peaks. "Rear group, next to Jesse, you listen to Colt, no exceptions." The rescue took 3 days. Day 1 was manageable. Colt picked the path Jesse sang to keep the horses calm, his voice not good but steady in a way that animals responded to. Eliza rode beside Jesse, solid in the way of someone who learned horsemanship on a working farm. Day 2, the storm arrived. Wind built through the morning snow fell sideways. Temperatures dropped so fast you could feel the cold arriving like a wall. 5 horses broke from the group and bolted toward Devil's Funnel. Nate sent the main herd on with Colt. He, Jesse, and Eliza pursued the breakaways. Devil's Funnel in ice. Granite walls glazed like glass. Gravel invisible under frozen meltwater. On both sides, the 20-meter drop to a creek bed where 3 years ago a trapper named Henriksen fell with his mule and was found in the spring thaw, his expression suggesting the fall gave him time to understand what was happening, but not time to make peace with it. Nate and Jesse went in first, turning the horses back. Eliza held the rear, and while turning a stubborn stallion, her horse lost its footing on the ice. Time slowed. The horse leaned left, toward the drop. She pulled the reins right, but the weight had shifted, and physics, which does not negotiate and does not care about courage, took over. The horse tilted. The edge appeared beneath them like a mouth opening. Below 20 meters of nothing, then rock. Nate reacted on instinct. 18 years in the saddle on terrain that killed the careless. He wheeled his horse, drove it forward across the slick ground, reached Eliza at the moment her horse went over the edge. His hand closed around her arm. The horse fell. The sound it made, the long descending scream followed by impact below, was a sound none of them would forget. But Eliza did not fall. Nate held her. He pulled her onto his saddle, and for 10 seconds, two people sat on one horse on the edge of a 20-meter drop, while wind howled around them and Nate's arm was around her waist with the force of a man who refused to let go of one more person. I have you. His voice close to her ear, low, steady, and for the first time not flat. A tremor so small only someone pressed against his chest would feel it. I have you. They lost the horse. The breakaways were gathered. And when they returned to base camp where Colt waited with fire and coffee, because Colt understood that people you send out need someone standing in the light when they come back, Eliza rode in front of Nate on his horse, her back against his chest, and neither spoke for 7 miles. The silence was not empty or defensive. It was the silence of two people who had looked at death together and chosen life. Eliza had sprained her wrist and bruised her shoulder. Martha wrapped the wrist and ordered rest. Eliza obeyed for 1 day. The second morning, she was in the kitchen at 4. Stubborn, Martha said. Practical. 15 people need breakfast. Martha looked at her with the expression a mother gives a daughter. Not biological. Chosen. The second threat arrived on foot. Harold Fairchild appeared in Moss Creek 10 days after the cold snap broke. He came from Cheyenne wearing an expensive wool overcoat, carrying a leather briefcase. He treated with the reverence most men reserve for loaded weapons. Harold was not the kind of villain stories prepare you for. He did not raise his voice or make threats of violence. His danger lay in his respectability and his administrative ruthlessness. He destroyed futures with paperwork and signatures while smiling and offering tea. Harold spent the afternoon conducting reconnaissance in Moss Creek. By evening, he knew everything. Eliza was at Wolf Ridge. She was working for Callahan. The town was talking, and Mrs. Adelaide Pruitt, the self-appointed matchmaker whose 23 candidates had all failed, was particularly irritated that the Nebraska girl had succeeded. Colt learned Harold had arrived through his network of informants, trappers, and bartenders cultivated over 7 years. Fairchild is in Moss Creek. Briefcase, papers, good suit. Who has he met with? Pruitt, Braddock the sheriff, the banker. The banker. Nate's eyes narrowed. He is building position, not attacking head-on, encircling. Nate told Eliza that evening with everyone present because he understood this was a family matter. Eliza's reaction was not fear. Her hands tightened under the table for a moment, but her voice was controlled with the precision of someone who had endured too long and finally found a place safe enough to be angry. The debt is fabricated. Harold never spent a cent on me. I worked without wages for 2 years. If anyone owes anyone, he owes me. Evidence? I have a ledger book, a copy of the farm's accounts I made before I left. Nowhere in those records does any debt appear with my name. Nate looked at her. For the first time in those gray eyes, something unmistakable appeared. Admiration. She fought with ledger books instead of tears, and for a man who respected competence the way other men respected beauty, that distinction mattered. But Harold was not the only predator circling. Senator Harlan Whitmore was 55 years old and the most powerful man in the Wyoming Territory. Tall, thin, silver-haired, with eyes sharp enough to cut paper and a smile that Colt once described as the smile a snake wears before it strikes. But Whitmore was not a simple villain. Born poor in Pennsylvania, son of a coal miner, killed in a mine collapse when Harlan was 13, everything Whitmore did was driven by the terror of returning to where he started. 10 years earlier, he had owned a small homestead and lost it when a larger landowner diverted the water supply during drought. That experience shaped his philosophy entirely. Control or be controlled. Own the water or die of thirst. The bitter irony was that the thing done to him was now the thing he was doing to others. Whitmore wanted Wolf Ridge for the creek, the fur trade route, and the strategic position. He had offered to buy. Nate refused. Partnership. Refused. Shared water rights. Refused. Thomas Callahan had refused before him. Whitmore began quietly, an inspection team to review land and water records. Then he pressured the Moss Creek Bank to freeze Wolf Ridge's credit lines. The isolation was slow, systematic, and devastating. Colt discovered the connection on a Tuesday evening. Fairchild met with Whitmore's man, private room at the hotel, 2 hours, not social. Whitmore had recruited Harold. The senator needed a tool to destabilize Wolf Ridge and Harold with his fraudulent debt And legal pretensions was perfect. Harold provided the chaos. Whitmore provided the political muscle. A pincer movement closing on the mountain. When Colt delivered this information, Nate stood by the fireplace, his back to the room, silent for 5 minutes. Martha spoke from the kitchen. Thomas dealt with something like this 30 years ago. A politician wanting water. He won with truth, not guns. My father had 30 years of reputation, Nate said. I have rumors about an unmarried girl living in my house. The rumors had already started. Harold was feeding them, implying without stating that the arrangement between Eliza and Nate was improper. The town was splitting. Businesses began running out of items when Jesse came to buy. The blacksmith became too busy. The post office developed delays. But Eliza was not the kind of woman who sat still while storms gathered. She wrote letters to 3 women in Lincoln she trusted. Mrs. Sarah Whitfield, the fabric shop owner. Miss Ann Peters, the school teacher. Mrs. Eleanor Grant, the minister's wife. She asked each for written confirmation that she had lived and worked without wages at the Thornton Fairchild farm and that no debt existed. 3 signed witness confirmations arrived within 2 weeks. Then Eliza opened the cedar chest. Nate gave permission after 2 days of internal struggle. What Eliza found surprised her. These were not amateur sketches. These were art. Ink and charcoal drawings of the frontier rendered with extraordinary detail. Margaret Callahan had documented 30 years of mountain life, the peaks, the creek, the horses, the Shoshone families, the endless sky. A visual record created by a woman in one of the most remote places in America, documenting a world already disappearing. Mr. Callahan, your mother's drawings are worth considerably more than you know. There is a gallery in Cheyenne. If you will allow it, I would like to take a few pieces for appraisal. His jaw locked. I am not selling my mother. I'm not asking you to sell your mother. I am asking you to let the world see how she saw this land. A long silence. Then something in his eyes shifted. Not walls coming down, a window opening. Because Eliza had not said the drawings were valuable. She had said they were a way of seeing, and Nate understood that keeping his mother's work locked in a dark chest was not protecting her. It was silencing her. All right, but you do not go to Cheyenne alone. Jesse went with her. Colt stayed to guard the stronghold. At the Pemberton and Hale Gallery in Cheyenne, the English art collector Alistair Pemberton nearly fell from his chair. 30 years of first-hand frontier documentation from a woman's perspective. Do you understand how rare this is? $8,000 for 12 pieces, enough to cover every frozen credit line, buy winter supplies, and hire a lawyer. But Eliza did not decide alone. The decision belonged to Nate. While she was in Cheyenne, Harold came to Wolf Ridge directly. No warning. I am Harold Fairchild from Lincoln, Nebraska. I am here to speak with my niece. Miss Thornton is not here, Martha said, her voice like steel wrapped in velvet. I will wait. You will wait outside. Madam, I have legal documentation. You have paper. Colt stepped into the doorway. His presence filled it in a way that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with stillness. Paper does not carry weight on Wolf Ridge. Sheriff Braddock is in Moss Creek if you want to discuss law. Harold assessed him the way a businessman assesses risk. What he saw was not a bluff. I will return with a lawyer and court papers. You do that. Colt closed the door. When Eliza returned, Jesse delivered additional news that changed everything. Catherine Prescott is back in Moss Creek. The name landed like a stone in still water. Catherine now. Catherine Harrington had arrived from Cheyenne. 30 years old, still beautiful, but differently sharper, more tired. Douglas Harrington had gone bankrupt and vanished. She came for shelter and for Nate. Nate met her at the Moss Creek Cafe. Colt waited outside, leaning against a post watching the street. Catherine cried, told him about the bankruptcy, said she had been wrong, said she missed him. Nate listened to all of it, his coffee untouched, his jaw set, his gray eyes focused on her face with attention that was no longer warm. The attention of a man looking at his past and understanding that the past was exactly where it belonged. I forgive you, Catherine, but I am not what you need. Is there someone else? He did not answer immediately. In the silence, he realized the answer was yes, not a declaration, but yes. A presence, hazel eyes, a girl who had walked up a mountain, not because of him, but because of herself. And it was exactly that, the not needing him, that had allowed him to begin needing her. Yes, Catherine gave him one more thing before they parted. On the train, she had sat beside a talkative man named Fairchild, who mentioned a senator's name. That was when all the pieces locked together. Whitmore had recruited Harold. The senator needed chaos around Wolf Ridge. Harold was the tool. Nate called a meeting, everyone at the table. For the first time, he said we instead of I. Whitmore wants Wolf Ridge. Harold wants Eliza. They have joined forces. We have two enemies and one objective. Keep this place. Keep Eliza safe. Eliza confronted Harold in Moss Creek alone in public at the cafe. She placed the confirmations and ledger on the table. This is the truth, Mr. Fairchild. You have no debt. You have two choices. Leave quietly or I take everything to the newspapers, including the real reason you wanted me back. You wanted to trade me to Pennington for the grain contract. I have your letter to him. You wrote the girl will comply after the wedding. They always comply. Harold did not smile. He left Moss Creek 3 days later, 4 in the morning. No announcement. First enemy defeated by a ledger book and a woman who refused to comply. But Whitmore remained, and Whitmore did not fear truth. He had spent 30 years building his own version of it. Through his lawyer, Whitmore delivered an ultimatum. 48 hours, sell the water rights at 10 cents on the dollar or face a formal investigation that would tie Wolf Ridge in litigation for years under temporary custodial management, which meant Whitmore. The clock began. Part 2 ends in the kitchen at night. Nate at the window, Eliza beside him, shoulders close but not touching. 3 inches between them that both were aware of with an intensity that made the air between them feel solid. I do not want to lose this place, Nate said. You will not. You cannot promise that. No, but I can promise you are not fighting alone. Not anymore. He looked at her. Gray eyes met Hazel. Between them, something shifted. Not a declaration, not a kiss. An acknowledgement silent and certain that they had become important to each other in a way neither had planned. Outside, the wind moved across the mountain, and somewhere in it, you could hear the beginning of the end. Not of Wolf Ridge, of the walls, of the fear, of the loneliness. 48 hours. The clock was running. Nate called the final meeting in the kitchen. Martha's kitchen. The warmest room, the room where bread was baked and wounds were dressed and coffee was poured at 4 in the morning. Martha had said once that every important thing in the history of the human family has happened at a kitchen table. Nate had not believed her then. He believed her now. 5 people around the table. Nate at the head, Colt at the far end, arms crossed, scanning the room the way he scanned tree lines. Jesse to the left, his hat on the table, his usual grin, absent replaced by an expression that looked wrong on a face designed for the exclusive purpose of smiling. Martha to the right, straight-backed, radiating calm authority. And Eliza between Jesse and Martha, in a chair nobody assigned, but everyone recognized as correct. 24 hours before the deadline, Nate said. Whitmore wants the water rights. If I do not sign, he triggers years of litigation and territorial management, which means Whitmore runs Wolf Ridge without owning it. Or I sign and lose the water forever. There is a third choice, Eliza said. She sat with her hands flat on the table, her hazel eyes focused on some middle distance, where the problem existed as a shape she could see. Whitmore operates in darkness. The bank freeze was through intermediaries. The inspection papers were never filed with the actual territorial office. His alliance with the Herald was in private rooms. His power depends on secrecy. If we open those doors, if we drag everything into daylight, he loses. What daylight? The Cheyenne Daily Leader. They have been running a series on land corruption. If we give the editor real evidence, the ultimatum, the inspection records, the bank pressure, the Fairchild connection, that is a front-page story. A senator using his office to seize private land and water. Colt nodded, quick, decisive. Jesse smiled, the first real one in days. Martha said quietly, like Margaret, she used a pen instead of a sword too. Nate had not agreed. You know the risk. If Whitmore survives the scandal, he comes back 10 times harder. I know. The story will mention you, your name, your past, Harold, everything. I know. And you still want this, Nate. She said his name, and the sound of it spoken without the formal distance of Mr. Callahan rippled through the room. Jesse heard it. Colt heard it. Martha looked down at her hands. I lived 2 years in Harold's shadow because I was afraid of light. I will never do that again. The plan divided into 3 parts. Jesse would ride to Cheyenne 45 miles through the Cumberland Pass shortcut carrying every document to the editor, Thomas Garrett. Colt would guard Wolf Ridge. Nate would ride to Moss Creek and face Whitmore directly, not to negotiate but to buy time. Every minute Nate consumed at that table was a minute Whitmore was not thinking about Cheyenne. Jesse left before dawn. He stood before Eliza in the pre-dawn dark breath, a white cloud gap, toothed grin, visible even in faint light. If this were a fairy tale, I would be the knight riding out to save the castle. But this is Wyoming, so I am just a mountain man carrying mail. Less heroic, but no less important. Be careful, Jesse. My mother says I am too important to die young. He winked. Then he mounted Whiskey, the fastest horse at Wolf Ridge, and rode into the dark. The sound of hooves faded, and the mountain swallowed him. Eliza watched until she could no longer hear the hoofbeats. Colt stood behind her. He will be fine, not comfort. Fact. Nate left an hour later for Moss Creek. At Whitmore's lawyer's office, he sat down and began to negotiate, not to reach agreement, but to consume hours. Each question 10 minutes, each objection 20. He asked about terms, rates, schedules, exceptions, contingencies, and the specific definition of temporary as it applied to custodial management, a question that generated 45 minutes of circular conversation. Hour 6, Jesse changed horses at the relay station. Pushed on. Hour 8, Whitmore's patience fractured. I require an answer, Mr. Callahan. I require more time to review Section 7, Subsection 3. That is standard. Nothing is standard when it concerns water. And in that sentence was an echo of Thomas Callahan, who had said the same thing to a different politician 30 years earlier. Hour 10, Jesse reached Cheyenne, found the Daily Leader office, dropped the leather bag on Thomas Garrett's desk. Sir, you need to read this right now. Garrett was 52, a newspaper man since 16 with a nose for corruption as reliable as a compass. He read everything twice, then looked at Jesse with the expression of a man handed the story of the year. How much time do I have? The deadline is tomorrow morning. Garrett was writing before Jesse finished the sentence. Hour 12, Wolf Ridge. Night. Eliza on the front porch wrapped in wool watching stars. Colt beside her whittling a wooden horse with 2 riders on its back. 20 minutes of silence before Eliza spoke. Are you afraid, Colt, of what tomorrow? He stopped whittling, looked at her directly, something he almost never did because for Colt, direct eye contact was an act of intimacy. His gaze held something different in the starlight. Honesty, unguarded. I fear many things, not tomorrow. What? A long pause. He looked at the horse in his hands, the 2 tiny carved riders. Becoming the man I used to be. 6 words. The longest and most personal thing he had said to anyone in 7 years. The drifting, the dark year, the gun for hire, the men who died looking at his face, and the slow daily work of becoming someone worthy of this mountain and the people on it. Eliza did not ask more. You will never be that man again. Not here. Colt looked at her, nodded. Between 2 people who had both walked through darkness, that nod carried the weight of an oath. Hour 20. Nate returned exhausted but undefeated. He had bought 20 hours. Whitmore, when Nate put on his hat and left, had lost the confident smile. In its place was the first hairline crack in a dam. Do you sign or not, Callahan? I need more time. You do not have more time. I have enough. Nate climbed the last switchback in moonlight. Eliza was on the porch, not inside. On the porch in the cold where she had stood 3 weeks ago with a battered suitcase. But this time she was not shaking. She stood steady, auburn hair loose because the pins had given up hours ago, and when Nate climbed the steps, Eliza did something she had never done. She reached out and touched his arm, just fingertips on the leather of his coat sleeve. Nate stopped completely. He looked down at her hand with an expression that contained surprise and fear and gratitude, and something he had no name for. And for one moment, his face, usually so controlled, simply let them all exist. Jesse made it. The story runs tomorrow morning. He exhaled, a long breath carrying the weight of weeks. Thank you. For what? For being here. In the December twilight sky, burning red above the Bighorn Peaks, they stood side by side and the distance between their shoulders disappeared. Not because either stepped forward, because they both leaned in, the way two trees grow toward the same source of light. If everything goes well, Nate said, barely louder than the wind, there is something I want to ask you, but not today. I will be here when you are ready. Morning, the Cheyenne Daily Leader hit the streets with the sunrise. Senator Whitmore's water grabbed the Wolf Ridge scheme. Everything. The ultimatum, the fraudulent inspection team, the bank intimidation, the Fairchild Alliance. Garrett described Harold as a Nebraska grain merchant currently facing fraud allegations in his home state, a detail Garrett verified independently. The story described Wolf Ridge as the legacy of Thomas Callahan, who had managed the water fairly for 30 years. And it mentioned Eliza, not as a mail-order bride, as the woman who provided the crucial evidence, the ledger keeper who used truth to dismantle lies. Cheyenne erupted. Dozens of protest letters hit the territorial offices. Other senators demanded investigation. In Moss Creek, the townspeople who had been pulling away began returning. The general store had stock again. The blacksmith's schedule open. The post office delivered mail on time. The small, slightly shameful recalibration of a community that had allowed fear to override decency. Whitmore did not fall dramatically. He resigned, citing health concerns, the phrase everyone understood as admission, without admitting. He left on an eastbound train. Catherine Prescott took a westbound one to Denver, and Jesse mentioned it in passing one evening, the way you mentioned weather as a fact that had settled and no longer required discussion. But there was a moment Nate learned about through Garrett. In his office packing papers, Whitmore had paused at a window and looked west toward the Bighorns. Callahan's father said the same thing to me, 30 years ago. Nothing is standard when it concerns water. I should have listened the first time. The closest Whitmore would ever come to acknowledging what he had done. Jesse returned on the fourth day riding up the switchback on a borrowed horse because whiskey had thrown a shoe. He arrived to a welcome that embarrassed him. I just rode a horse and delivered papers. Eliza is the genius. I am the postman. You are more than that, Eliza said. I know. I am also extremely handsome, but I try not to lead with that. Later that evening, Jesse sat at the kitchen table writing a letter. Not to a lawyer, not to a newspaper. To his mother in Montana. For the first time in 2 years, he did not write that everything was fine. He wrote the truth. He wrote about Patrick, his brother, who died in the Butte mine, and the guilt he carried for not being there. He wrote about Wolf Ridge and Nate and Colt and Martha. And he wrote about Eliza Thornton, who threw a lantern at a grizzly bear to save his life. And he told his mother that he had found on a mountain in Wyoming a family he did not know he was looking for. When he sealed the envelope, his eyes were wet, and he did not bother to deny it because there was no one in the kitchen to deny it to, and even if there had been, Jesse McAllister was learning that tears were not weakness. They were proof that you still cared about something enough to hurt. The sale of Margaret's sketches was completed the following week. Pemberton traveled from Cheyenne to finalize in person. When he saw Wolf Ridge, the cliff, and the pines, and the creek running silver, and the peaks white against a sky so blue it hurt, he stood on the porch for a full minute. Then he turned to Nate. Now I understand. She was not drawing pictures. She was writing letters to the land. $8,000. Enough to clear every credit line, buy winter supplies, hire a Cheyenne lawyer specializing in water rights. The mountain was secure, but the real question arrived in the silence that followed. The silence of a house where danger has passed and the people inside must decide what they are to each other without crisis making the decision for them. Eliza's contract was expiring. Harold was gone. Whitmore was gone. The books were balanced. She no longer needed Wolf Ridge as a refuge. She had skills, reputation, savings, and a name known across the territory. She could go anywhere. For the first time in 22 years, she possessed genuine freedom, the kind not given but earned, built from courage, incompetence, and the stubborn refusal to be owned. That freedom was the final test. Because if she stayed now, it was because she chose to. And choice meant trust. Trust meant vulnerability. Both of them, the man abandoned by Catherine and the woman controlled by Harold, had built lives around avoiding exactly that risk. The conversation happened on an ordinary December afternoon. Not at night, not during a blizzard. Light snow falling meadow white to the horizon, chimney smoke rising straight in windless air. Eliza in the study finishing quarterly accounts, the last task before her arrangement ended. Nate entered, closed the door. Eliza. Nate. He sat across from her, hands on the desk, open palms up. The fists were gone. Your contract expires this week. You are free to go. Harold is gone. Whitmore is finished. You have money, skills, reputation. Anywhere. Anything. I know. So I need to ask, and whatever your answer, I will respect it. Do you want to stay, not for safety, not for work? Because I want you here. In a way I have not wanted anyone since Catherine left. And the wanting scares me more than blizzards or bears or senators. But I am more scared of what happens if I do not say it. Silence in the study. Snow outside the window. And Eliza Thornton, 22 years old, who had never been kissed, who had walked up a mountain in a storm because she had nowhere else to go, and found at the top not just shelter, but a man whose hands shook. When he opened his heart, understood that what he was doing now was braver than anything he had ever done on the mountain. Those things risked his body. This risked his soul. Nate, I walked 9 miles up a mountain in a blizzard to get here. How many more storms do you think it would take to drive me away? He smiled. For the first time in 4 years. 2 corners of a mouth rising and gray eyes finally allowing something warm to enter, like the first light of spring on a slope buried in snow. You are sure I am sure. Because I am terrible at feelings. I know. I will make you crazy. Probably, but you will also keep me warm through Wyoming winters, and that is enough. Nate stood, came around the desk, stood before her closer than he had ever been. He extended his hand, not a fist, not a grab, an open palm facing up the way you offer your hand to a horse you have been gentling for months. An invitation, not a command. Liza placed her hand in his, small and large, calloused against calloused. 2 hands that had worked and ached and survived meeting in the space between a desk and a window through which the Bighorn Mountains were visible in their eternal patient beauty. When their fingers closed, both understood. This was not an ending. This was a beginning. The wedding took place 2 weeks later. Small, simple. In the great room before the stone fireplace Thomas Callahan had built from granite, he quarried himself. The minister from Moss Creek officiated, a thin man with kind eyes, who said afterward he had never seen a groom look simultaneously so terrified and so certain. Martha stood beside Eliza, not as a bridesmaid, as the mother she had never had. She wore her best-dressed silver hair pinned with a tortoiseshell comb that had belonged to Margaret Callahan and that Martha had kept for exactly this occasion. Colt stood beside Nate, silent, steady. In his right pocket, his fingers closed around the last wooden horse he had carved. This one had 2 riders. Jesse was the best man and the only person who cried a fact he denied vigorously. It was dust. This cabin has an extraordinary amount of dust. In December, indoors, I am committed to this explanation. Nate spoke his vows, short because he was Nate, but short not from coldness. Each word selected with the same care he used to choose a trail through dangerous terrain. I am not good with words. I am good at being here. And I will be here with you every day, every season, every storm. That is my promise. Eliza spoke hers. I came to this place carrying nothing but a suitcase and my fear. You gave me a roof, and then, though you did not mean to, you gave me a reason to call it home. I promise to keep the books straight, the kitchen warm, and your heart safe. And if anyone ever says you are lonely, I will remind them you were never lonely. You were just waiting. Martha wiped her eyes. Jesse wept and denied it. Colt did not cry. But when Nate and Eliza kissed gently, briefly, with December sunset pouring through the window and lighting them in gold, Colt took the wooden horse with 2 riders from his pocket and placed it on the fireplace mantel next to the photograph of Thomas and Margaret Callahan. That night, the door closed softly. When morning came, everything had changed. Not because of what happened behind that door which belonged to them alone, but because they woke in the same place, looked through the same window at the same mountain, and knew this was the first morning of the rest of their lives. The final scene is not a climax. It is a breakfast. Morning after the wedding. The kitchen. Martha at the stove, Eliza beside her, the two women moving with seamless coordination. Sunlight through the window made patterns on the oak table, and the coffee pot sent steam curling toward the ceiling, and the stove threw warmth into the corners of the room, and it felt for the first time in years like a room that had enough people in it. Jesse came through the door, hat crooked, grin blazing. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Callahan. The bull elk with the personal grudge has returned to the western meadow. I am beginning to think he is actually in love with me." "The cow elk next to him calved this morning, Jesse," Martha said. "That makes more sense." Colt entered, silent, sat at the far end of the table, began eating. Pinned to his coat was a small wildflower, the kind that pushes through early winter snow, stubborn and unlikely and alive. Nobody commented, but Martha saw it and smiled. Nate entered last. He stood in the kitchen doorway, the same doorway where 3 weeks ago he had stood watching Eliza with the wariness of a man who had built his life around preventing this exact moment. He looked at Jesse talking, at Colt eating, at Martha and Eliza working side by side, at the steam rising and the light coming through the window and the fire burning in the stove his father had hauled up this mountain by mule. And he understood. What Wolf Ridge had been missing was not a wife. It was completeness. The feeling that every chair had someone sitting in it, that every empty space had been filled, that the fortress his father built had finally come to contain the thing it was always meant to contain. "Good morning, Mr. Callahan," Eliza said with a smile that 3 weeks ago had been a ghost and was now real. "Good morning, Mrs. Callahan." Jesse looked between them, then turned to Colt. "Do you notice anything different about the boss today?" Colt looked up, looked at Nate, looked at Eliza, and then in a moment Jesse swore he would tell his grandchildren about Colt's smile. A real smile. Both sides. Full and genuine. And so unexpected Jesse dropped his fork. "Yes," Colt said, "he is here." And that sentence spoken by the quietest man in Wyoming said everything that needed to be said. Nate Callahan, 32 years old mountain man, a man who had rejected 23 brides because he was terrified of being abandoned, was finally here. Not in the room, in his life. Present. Arrived home. Outside snow fell on Wolf Ridge. Wind moved through the pines. Callahan Creek ran its course down the slope carrying water to the valley below, where it would nourish 20 farms in one small town, and a future none of them could see yet, but all of them would shape. The Bighorn Peak stood white against blue sky, indifferent to human joy and sorrow, as mountains are, but present as mountains always are, bearing witness. And in the kitchen of the fortress that Thomas Callahan built with his bare hands on a ridge above the world, 5 people sat around a table and ate breakfast. 3 mountain men, a housekeeper, and a girl from Nebraska who had walked up a mountain in a blizzard carrying everything she owned in one hand and her courage in the other. That is how Wolf Ridge was saved. Not with guns, not with money, with a ledger book and a newspaper and a carved wooden horse and a girl who walked uphill into a storm.